May Day, International Labour Day of Workers' Day, these phrases are used interchangeably for this globally celebrated day to honour the contribution of workers worldwide to growth and development in their respective countries.
Yeah, SA officially calls it National Workers' Day, and the day is mainly associated with the struggle for workers' rights and social justice as South Africa's democracy reaches the 29-year milestone. We are joined by the Minister of Employment and Labour, Minister Thulas Nxesi, to really just chat around some Workers' Day issues and, of course, what we're expecting in some of the celebrations this morning. Minister, good morning to you, and thank you so much for giving us time on the agenda.
Thank you and good morning. And happy Workers' Day.
Happy Workers' Day to you too, Minister. I think a really great place to start is something about Workers' Day, I think, especially for me, sounds exclusionary, right? Because there's a sense that we're talking about those that actually have jobs when we've got a really big problem. Yeah, okay, the past 2 terms or 2 quarters, we've seen some improvement in our unemployment numbers, but it's still 7.8 million people unemployed. So even as we get around to Workers' Day, does unemployment in South Africa give you sleepless nights, and how does it factor into this day?
Well, obviously, as we salute the workers who stood in the history of our country to organize themselves into the progressive unions and to wage the historic struggles against the exploitative system of apartheid, we still remain with serious challenges. We can count on what I would call a number of what we would call the labor legislation, which we have, the unemployment insurance, the occupational health and safety, the basic conditions of employment, including the national minimum wage, employment equity, and so on, compensation of occupational, but and these are, or this labor regime is undergirded by those fundamental principles of decent, improved the living standards, reduction of poverty, increased productivity, life, access to social equity or social security. But the reality is we are faced with a number of challenges. We are faced with high unemployment. We are faced with slow growth. We are faced with the energy crisis. And all those are leading to mass unemployment. So as we celebrate, we must, as we reflect on this day, we must be able to say, what are the new challenges which are facing us? There are new challenges facing us. And if you talk about digitization today, you talk about the introduction of technology, you talk about new atypical workers. The gig economy has introduced a new type of workers, but also the informality which we're having. Those workers remain exposed, and we have to deal with that and relook at our legislation, how to protect those workers.
Yeah. And Minister, speaking about those unemployment stats, it's year in, year out again. We are told by Stats SA that in the majority we find that it's the marginalized, the poor, black, who are in the majority unemployed. There's also been a response, at least from government side, with the new BEE transformation policies that have been put on the table. And then you have the likes of AfriForum who are saying that such a bill is, such an act rather, is racist and therefore should be challenged in court.
I think we have to accept that unemployment is very high. We have to do something extra to deal with this in terms of our programs. But also, we have to ensure that including the private sector plays its particular role. We've been talking about localization, we've talking about how do we increase the small businesses and the public employment programs, how do we deal with them? And we think that if we can all work very hard together with the private sector, we can be able to increase the numbers of those who are employed, touching on the issue of unemployment. The employment equity is very fundamental to this country, and we know the history of this particular country. But we're not dreaming that it's just going to be given on a silver platter. We have to come very hard to those who are protecting the privileges of the past, the apartheid privileges. And we have to share the wealth of this particular country. And we have to introduce very harsh measures, to those who are resisting, including if they want to do business with government. We have to ban them not to do business if they are resisting employment equity. We know exactly what is happening in the profile of many companies. The management remains white, it remains male, and they are not taking into consideration that they have to transform. We have to deal harshly with those issues, because if we do not transform this country, it means we are leaving it as is, and the majority of the people are not going to be able to benefit from this. Let me just touch on another very sensitive issue. What we've also seen is the employment of the undocumented workers. And the reason is not that the employers love those workers. In the many sectors, you go to the agriculture, you go to security, in the retail, and in those industries, including the truck drivers, in those industries, in the freight and trucking, you find that they are interested in employing the undocumented foreign nationals, not because they love them, just not because they want to exploit them. They want to break the collective agreements, and knowing that these people are very desperate, they will take any type of a job as long as it's something to survive. And we have noticed that the employers are doing that. We're looking at the measures, very harsh measures to deal with those employers. Whilst we're dealing with our labor migration policy, which is trying to address those issues, we're also going to amend the legislation in order to talk to such exploitative measures which are employed by a number of the employers. So it's true, a number of workers, whether they are foreign or even local, are still being exploited. But what is also worrying is the disintegration of the trade union movement. And we can see that they are breaking into smaller pieces, and that is impacting on the unity of the workers. The slogan which say, unite and organize, is being undermined. We're also seeing the dwindling rate of unionization in the workplace, which is a very, very serious problem, which I think the workers must also reflect on that. Because if you don't have the strong unions in the factory floor, who are our eyes and ears, it's not going to impact positively on the workers, because the nature of our legislation, it's such that it allows the employer and the employers to be able on their own to negotiate better conditions of service.
But Minister, shouldn't government also be taking some responsibility for this? You speak about, for instance, the lack of transformation in the workplace, one, and we know what the Employment Equity Report tells us year in, year out again, and then also the employment of foreign nationals. Legislation is already there. Which company has any criminal cases been brought against by the state?
Just to start with the last one. It's just that we cannot be able to, I cannot be able at this point to mention. We have, through our inspectorate, gone into a number of workplaces, and in those workplaces we've been able to find the employers who are violating. And ours is to take them to court. We've taken some of them to court, but unfortunately, they will get a slap on the hand. They will just be fined 10,000 rand, 20,000 rand. And then the question is, what's the point of finding somebody 10 to 20,000 rands who is making millions? They even budget for that. So what they do, they violate the law and budget for that. They know that they're going to be arrested and they will have to go to court and answer that. But they are prepared. What we have to do now is to introduce new measures. And I've been thinking that one of the measures which I'll be proposing to Parliament is to say, those who continue to do that, we are going to talk about deducting heavily on their revenues, so that they feel the impact, because it's like now the punishment is too light, they are not feeling that. So in terms of the current labor legislation, we're tightening up our national labor migration policy, which speaks to a number of issues. But unfortunately, because legislation takes very long, it's going to be, I would say, something which you can be able to achieve in the medium process or in the medium term. But we are there, and because we also have to amend some of the legislation, especially the employment legislation, to cater for the documented workers, but not for the undocumented workers, because the reality is that it has to do with our porous borders. And I think Minister Nxesi is doing a lot in terms of the border management, which is trying to ensure that our borders are not as porous as they were supposed to be. So there's a lot which government is doing, but we have to do that with the cooperating employers and the trade union movement.
I think, Minister, one of the things that we might miss as a country is we certainly write the legislation, and I wonder just how far it trickles down to the worker that perhaps may miss all the jargon, right? I mean, you recently, alongside with the President, signed into law the Compensation for Occupational Injuries and Diseases Act. And I want to get into that a little bit. How you explain it to the layman, the domestic worker who's listening to this conversation right now and says, how does any of this help me?
Yes, it's correct that we do have a large number of the workers who are uninformed about these laws. But we have started a massive education program where we're trying to empower these workers about their rights. So there's a massive education program where we're trying to educate the workers about their rights and also their responsibility. But we had hoped that the unions which are organizing in those sectors will work jointly with us. We take the programs to those workers for them to be able to understand what is happening. But also we do have about 136 labor centers in this country where we want the workers to visit the labor centers which are nearest to them to be able to know about their rights, or whenever they are having problems at their work situation, they are able to report to those labor centers, and then we look at the people who are going to be able to help them. So we're hard at work over and above the strategy which we're having to say, how do we also work with the civil society, which is going to help these particular workers, together with the trade unions which are organizing in those sectors in order to help that. And now you are correct to say you can have good legislation, but the implementation is something else. Hence, you have to have that mass conscientization of the workers about their rights. But it still remains. Strong unions on the factory floor are very, very key. We're very worried about this disintegration because instead of being united and fighting for their rights, they are fighting amongst themselves.
Yeah, you talk about the role then of trade unions and really getting those messages out to the workers. But Minister, the reality is what we've seen over the past year is that the relationship between union and government really is at an all-time low. Let's be honest with ourselves. We've seen an ongoing strike where public service workers are concerned. I mean, are you worried about the state of what things look like between state and unions, particularly when you get to the bargaining table?
Hang on. Let's not have our short memories. The biggest strike in the public sector was in 1988. A very big strike, which involved all the sectors of the public sector, all of them. That was the biggest strike. And after that, we put the proper legislation. And that legislation has very clear dispute resolving mechanisms, including going to the labor court or even to the constitutional court. That's what has been happening. But what we must accept is that the issue of the salary negotiations, the issue of the salary pay, is still going to be an issue for the next 100 years in private or even in the public sector companies. That's why we have procedures to deal with those issues. But if you look into the other issues, we are doing well. If you look into the private sector, there have been big strikes, but those strikes have been resolved through the mechanisms which are in the legislation today. And so strikes are still going to be there because workers have the right to strike. It's in the Constitution, but there are ways of addressing those particular issues. What also worries us in the private sector, people, when they go on legal strike, it's very easy to be to be expelled by the employers, who are very, very concerned. And we are cautioning the employers in doing this. But if you gauge it according to the recent public sector negotiations, I don't think we have a crisis. We have a way. The majority of the union signed that particular agreement. The minority did not sign. That's what happens in the bargaining. That's the game. But on the other issues, socio-economic issues, we are together. We're trying to address those issues together. And as I say, during these hard economic times, we have a choice. We give the high salaries to the unemployed and forget about the million unemployed. So it's always a balancing act on how we have to deal with these issues. But I can tell you, in the public sector, even during COVID, all the workers enjoyed their benefits in full. In the other sector, they didn't enjoy those benefits. And what has been offered recently has been better off. But we are not saying it might be able to deal with the crisis which we are facing of very high fuel and food prices, but at least something has been done. But when you're faced with hard economic conditions, you have some choices which you will have to do. And that's what has faced us. And remember, even prior to COVID, this country's economy was almost in recession. Came COVID, then we lost 2 million jobs. Came the disruptions, the riots, which impacted on the jobs in KZN and also in Gauteng. So those were all the issues which were facing us, and that's why when we deal with these issues, we have to consider a balancing act. And the last point I want to make here, when you talk about public expenditure, it's well and easy to say, give more money. But on the other hand, do you talk about where do you get extra revenue? That's a very big debate. Do you impose more tax? It's a big debate. So hence I'm saying it's a very big balancing act. And I want to say, on a number of issues, we're still together. We continue to be together. On salaries, sometimes we differ. But in the long run, this issue of the salary negotiations is always controversial in any sector, by the way.
Yeah. Minister, and quickly on that proposal that was made by Treasury, the two-pot pension and savings reforms proposal, how far are we with regards to that? Because the proposal was supposed to be implemented by March 2023, where workers are able to withdraw at least 1/3 of their pension savings.
I would not be able to give the details, but I would say that process is on course, and the minister will be engaging at the level of NEDLEC and some legislative changes which have to be made. And remember that once you talk about such a reform, it also means legislative changes, and legislative changes do not go normally at the pace at which we want them. But I think the process is on, and Treasury can speak better on that. But I know that as a member of the cabinet, the process is on.
Thank you so much for your time. That is Thulas Nxesi, the Minister of Labour.